Well, Micah, this is a fascinating time.
It's just a fascinating time.
We're going to talk to each other. I think earlier you said, let's talk to each other like we're at our kitchen table. Like we're at our kitchen table. And we're going to talk to each other about serving women well, shepherding, in a Me Too, Church Too culture. So that's the intro.
It is the intro.
What you got to say?
Thank you for calling us ragtag and not raggedy.
We're raggedy too.
Yeah, that's true. We are raggedy.
That's okay. We're God's raggedy church.
That's right. Praise the Lord. He's still claiming us. He's still claiming us. I want to just open up. So this is great. We're gonna just kind of go back and forth and have a free flowing conversation about this very important issue. And I want to just ask you this. Why do you think it's vital?
Me?
Yes, you. Why do you think it's vital for believers to understand that caring for abused people is a gospel issue? Right? It's a gospel issue.
That it's a gospel issue. Mm-hmm. I think I'd love to hear your answer on this too. What my mind immediately goes to is that at the center of the gospel narrative itself is a traumatic event that calls for us to believe it. God, in God's divine wisdom and mercy, decided to make the moment that would change all of the world forever be one that was traumatic and abusive. And the gospel itself requires that we believe on the witness of that event. And there's something about denying the story, the pain, the suffering of the abused that is denying of the love of God itself. So I think that's why I take it so seriously as someone who loves and needs the gospel, is that I see God choosing to identify his great redemptive story with a traumatic event that calls for our belief.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you mentioned that. And it's interesting that not only does God call us to sort of proclaim this, but at the Lord's Supper, right? We continually are called to witness this, right? We're called that it's the Lord puts this sin on display, right? He says, look, this is the ugliness of sin. Right. This is the horror of sin, including the sin of sexual assault and abuse, because Jesus was not crucified fully clothed. The Romans, as a part of the humiliation of their victims, would strip their victims naked, right, in order to shame them and in order to show, because it seems that sexual assault is not fundamentally about sex. Right. It's fundamentally about power. Right. Right, and the misuse of power. Okay, and so it's really. So God shows the misuse of power right there at the center of the gospel, and shows it, and through the cross and resurrection shows that He has overcome it by the power of the gospel. By the power of the gospel. Can you talk to us a little bit about power in the church, and about how abuse and power are related?
How abuse and power are related. So I think, I'm a big fan of the book of Genesis. I feel like if we can just go back and read the first few chapters, it could help us a lot. And power, we see the jockeying for power at play from the very beginning. From the very beginning. So even before we have post-Pentecost, the church, at the very beginning, we see this lust for power, because ultimately power and wealth, so I would say power and greed, and to the extent that money affords us power, helps us to pretend that we are God.
Mm.
That's why they're so attractive, right? So Eve is tempted and manipulated around this idea of like, you can't trust God.
Right.
You got to have this. You got to have this power, right? And we see just a matter of a couple generations later, the perversion of power in one of their future offsprings, which is Lamech.
Right.
We find the first polygamist in Scripture. And not only is he a polygamist, I would argue that he seems to be demonstrating some very clear tendencies to be a domestic abuser.
Right.
What we find in the text is that he brags about to his two wives, right? The ability to kill a man and to avenge a man. So he's talking trash in a violent way to these two women, right? Domineering.
Right.
And so there is something about wanting to be God and the perversion of power. Power is designed to be given away. This is what God does for us. And I think the church struggles with a great fear of being persecuted. And when we fear being persecuted, which is what happens to the real church, by the way, but when we fear being persecuted, we will become persecutors. And we'll do that on a social level, a local church level, and even in a familial level.
Right.
We may find ourselves as persecutors when we live by this fear.
Right. There's a passage I want to lift up from Ecclesiastes 4:1. It said, and it talks about, it really does get into this issue of power. It says, again, I looked and I saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. It says, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. And this is what it says. It says, power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. Right? Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. Right? And those two things, oppression, right? Freedom from oppression, right? And comfort to those who are mourning are they're like the announcements that Jesus intentionally makes when he quotes from Isaiah 61 in that synagogue in Nazareth, when he talks about setting at liberty the captives, right, and coming to comfort those who grieve, who mourn, right, and actually giving them a crown of beauty rather than ashes, which was a kind of a symbol of mourning and grief. And so Jesus actually comes to free those who are oppressed and those who have no comforter. So how can we do a better job in the church of actually following Christ in that and exemplifying the Christ who sets the captives free, right, and comforts those who mourn? What can we do? What can we do to kind of to come alongside and represent Him in service to Him in that mission as it pertains to issues of sexual assault in the church?
So, Jesus is not an insecure God. And our insecurities create that lust for power. So Jesus lives a life and then gives it away. I mean, God has chosen to give us an example of He who holds all power relinquishing power, because God is not insecure.
Right.
And to the extent that we find ourselves in the church being grotesquely insecure, we will see the ways in which we hoard power.
Right.
We will take positions that aren't meant to be about power
Right.
and make them about power.
Right.
And when that happens, we have missed an opportunity to represent Jesus well.
Right.
Jesus is not insecure. Jesus gives away power.
Yeah.
Jesus has came to serve and still serves us, has left the Spirit to do such,
Right.
To equip us, to comfort us. So I think that's a start, is for us to maybe do some honest confession about the fact that we think that we're keeping ourselves, to do some honest confession about whether or not there are parts of our religious traditions that we find attractive because they give us power.
Yep.
Particularly in a world and a society when that might be taken away from us.
Right.
I mean, I find this to be particularly important. This is an ethnically mixed group. If it was an all African American group, I would probably have a more direct conversation with African American men about what it means to be demasculinated in society and then be attracted to religious traditions that offer you what looks like the ability to be lord over women.
Right.
But I won't have that conversation in a mixed group because I respect and honor black men, and I know this game. I know this game well, where we take words and we use it against black folk, so that's why you don't see me talk like that. But that is a conversation that needs to be had, right? And what is it about that, right? So I think we have to do some repentance, and it needs to be a part of our liturgical practices and our worship practice.
Right.
We need to be honest. We need to say, Lord, search me.
Yeah.
Do I like to feel like I'm running things, or I'm in power, or do I want people to see the Lord high and lifted up, or do I just want to be right?
Right.
Do I like this tradition because it says I'm the only one who gets to speak right now? But we have to search ourselves about that.
Absolutely, absolutely, and realize we have a tendency to be silent around issues of sexual assault for the sake of our own political expedience.
Yes.
Right.
Talk about that.
So that seems to be that is the testimony of Genesis 34, where there's a clear example of sexual assault when Dinah, the daughter of Leah, right, is raped by Shechem, who is the prince of the Hivites. And Jacob had moved the covenant community in front of Shechem, okay, and where he should be supposed to be going to Bethel, he went to Shechem, and he did that because Shechem was an important city at that time. It was a main primary trade route, and so Jacob was trying to establish kind of a cultural and economic connection and political connection, and he had been there for a number of years, and so his daughter goes there. His daughter is raped, and Jacob, the scripture says, falls silent. Right? He falls silent. And we know that Jacob was not a stoic man, because when he thought that Joseph was killed, he went crazy. He lost it. He fell out, right? And his sons had to pick him up and try to restore him, and he just couldn't. But when it comes to this less valued daughter,
yes.
Because after all, she was the daughter of Leah, who was the less valued wife. Okay? He falls silent for the sake of his political connections. Okay? So, what are some ways that you would suggest that we see that maybe happening today? What are some ways in which church denominations, churches, pastors are, so this is in the scriptures because we're prone to do this.
Yes.
Right? God didn't waste words, right? He says this, but he put Genesis 34 here because we need Genesis 34. Right? He puts it in the Bible because we need it, because he knows our tendency. So what are some ways in which you would suggest we are perhaps tempted in this way or do this today?
Ways in which we're falling silent.
Ways in which we're falling silent, or ways in which perhaps we're falling silent for the sake of political expedience. What are some of them?
And for the sake of political gain.
Yeah, for the sake of political gain.
Well, there was an event that happened not too long ago, a social political event, a national one. So our ability to ignore characterological behavior held by leaders that shows clear evidence of the denigration of women, but because we think they might advance our political cause, we say, let's give them some more power.
Right.
Let's give them access to nuclear weapons, by the way. So that's one that comes to mind very easily, and I'm happy to talk about that for a long time.
Right.
And I know it makes people uncomfortable, but it's just true. Yeah. And the credibility that has been lost, we cannot even fathom the credibility. And the uptick of abuse and sexual abuse and the defense of it, because that's what happens.
Right.
So falling silent in order to have political gain,
Yeah.
or to even have the possibility
Right.
of political gain. I mean, it may not even work out.
Right.
I think certainly churches who have reports of abuse of children or adults within their congregation who choose to not submit to wisdom that is available in which to handle those things, to deal with it as a crime. That is an example of falling silent for political gain in order to make sure the image of the church is propped up. In those cases, we have decided that this victim is simply not worth it.
Right.
And we want to uphold the illusion of a church that is safe when it's really dangerous.
That's exactly right.
And that the temptation to do that, I think it's easy for us to look at that and go like, oh my God, that's awful. Man,
it's a huge temptation.
That's a huge temptation.
Yeah.
That's a huge temptation, because we know that incident, it will color the entire ministry.
Right.
Now, of course, the longer you wait to say something, the worse it gets, right?
Yeah.
But that temptation is there. This falling silent for political gain also includes in poorly handling, mishandling, or not handling allegations of sexual assault, abuse, and domestic violence in the church.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we know, I'm glad you mentioned loss of credibility, because that's exactly what happened to Jacob, right? Right. His sons, right? His sons were outraged, not just about what happened to Dinah, their sister, but about Jacob's response, right? So they take it upon themselves, because they didn't see a gospel response exemplified through Jacob. They take it upon themselves to go to Shechem and to slaughter all the men there, right? And when Jacob tries to rebuke them, they rebuke him. When he says, "Oh, you all made me a stench in the land," and they point their finger at him and say, "Well, should he have treated our sister like a prostitute?" And the chapter ends on that question. The chapter ends with them pointing the finger at him. And so that's interesting, because when we look at the movement, when we look at Me Too, we wonder, why didn't Me Too start in the church? Right? Why did it take Alyssa Milano to say Me Too? Why didn't it? Because we got Genesis 34. And that warns us. It warns us thousands of years before Alyssa Milano. We should have been leading the charge on this. And so, we lose credibility. And we got to be careful how we criticize people when we aren't speaking up for the victims that they're speaking up for. Right? We have to have.
It's very tempting to critique methodology.
Right.
And that's an easy thing to target.
Right.
I don't think you're doing this right.
Right.
I mean, that happens all the time in Christian spaces. I don't think you're doing this right. But people are doing something.
Right.
A crisis, a sin, a wickedness, it demands a response. And so don't deflect in your cowardliness by saying, I don't like your methodology.
Right.
When they're at least trying to do something. And certainly this is the critique with Black Lives Matter as well.
Right, exactly.
Well, then do something.
Doing something.
Do something, exactly Bible believers. Do something.
Yeah, exactly. And that's exactly what you see happening in that text, right? They're should he have treated our sister like a prostitute? They're saying, but don't you see this suffering?
Right.
Are you going to just ignore this suffering? So we lose a lot of credibility.
As a clergy person who serves at a local church, I talked about the temptation to cover up or to be overwhelmed by a report of abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse of a child, etc. Right. And I'm wondering if you might be willing to share. I've got a story in mind too about maybe an encounter or an experience in which you observed, saw, or had to deal with an issue of abuse in the local church. And I can think about the first time I experienced it in that space as well.
Right. Yeah. I wish I could say that, so we live in a fallen world. So whether or not you realize that this is going on in your church, It just is, okay? And so...
Are you sure that's not slander? No, I'm sure. Go ahead.
I mean, I'm just talking about total depravity, right?
Amen. Amen.
It's just the doctrine
Amen.
of sin. This is going
Amen.
on, okay? This is happening.
Amen.
This is happening. And so we live in a culture where 1 out of 3 women will experience some form of sexual violence. 1 out of 5 men. And so you just think about how many women are in your church, how many men are in your church, and you know that this has happened in your church. There's a significant number of people that if you don't equip yourself to care well for these folks, then you will not be shepherding a significant number of God's people well through perhaps the worst experience of their life. And so it's really, really important that we be equipped and that we go into this with a sense of humility and love. As a pastor, I've seen this. I've encountered work. I've had the opportunity, the privilege of working alongside and with survivors of sexual assault, including one who was actually assaulted in our own worship service. Okay, during prayer time.
The church may not have been more than about 6 months old.
Church was just around 6 months old, and this woman who had been visiting our church came and shared that she had been fondled during the congregational prayer, and there was we're a young church just out of the gate, church plant. And there was a tremendous kind of pressure to think, well, if we tell folks, if we tell our congregation, if it gets out that somebody had been had experienced assault in our worship service, what is that going to do to the visitor numbers? What is that going to do to the relationship with the community? Right?
What would that do with the decision to leave the doors open or shut?
Exactly.
What would that do with profiling people that were in the church?
And so it was a tremendous pressure. And it was actually through conversations with you. And this is why, brothers, listen to your wife, right? It was through conversations with you and just through prayer that, I remember having a conversation with you, and I remember you saying, look, you better say something quick, And I said, she's right. We better say something. No, because we had already met with the sister that this happened to, okay? And we had already decided, as we met with the sister that this happened to, that we were going to come alongside her and report this to the police. Right? Because we got to recognize that, this is a crime has been committed, right? So it was immoral, it was a sin, it was also criminal. Okay, and so we have to be able to lay hold of both of those things and say, if something criminal happened to you, it is not a contradiction of grace, right, to seek out legal action. Right? We have to be willing to go with victims, to call the police, to file the report, to shepherd them as they go through this. Okay? And that includes if the person that did this is a member of our church,
right?
We've still got to be willing to go that route. Mm-hmm. And I've had opportunities in the past I had opportunities in the past with someone who committed domestic violence in our church, who was a member in our church. Both of the folks were members of our church, and in fact sat down and called. And I told this dear brother, I said, look, I still have a pastoral responsibility for you, and I'm going to help you call the police on yourself. And if they take you to jail, I'm coming to jail to visit you. I'm going to pray with you and pray for you, okay? But we're going to deal with this, okay? And because this justice is on the agenda of grace, because, listen, it's grace to the person that you have victimized.
Right.
That you face justice in this way. So it was grace to the community that we called the police It was grace to the community that we were transparent and said, listen, and wrote a letter to the community and shared with the community, the church, hey.
It's vitally important, because if a behavior like that happens in the church, you don't know if there are other victims.
Other victims.
And so you have to tell the truth.
Yeah.
There could be somebody waiting. There could be a child waiting for someone to talk about this thing.
Yeah.
And if you cover it up, you have covered their opportunity to receive the grace and healing that they deserve.
That's exactly right. Because so many victims are just saying, they think that they are alone. They think they are the only one. And they feel shame, okay? And they just want to shrink back in darkness. Nobody has to know. But when they hear the congregation say, we take this seriously, this is sin against the Lord, it's sin against the Lord's people, and we are committed to having to the Lord's house being a place of refuge and safety. And so when they hear you say that, and you kind of make that as a part of your church culture, then people will come forward. And other people who are victims and are fleeing or are dealing with this, they will get the sense that you are a church that cares about this. And it's interesting. In the wake of that kind of culture, we've had a number of folks that actually come to our church and join our church because they sense that the church is a place, New City is a place of safety and a place that takes this seriously. So rather than sort of drive people away, the Lord has a way of bringing folks to join. So do you have a story that you want to share about this?
Well, when I think about issues of abuse in the church, so I remember when we were married, we've been married for almost like a good part of 20 years, so almost 18 years. Yeah. And we may have been married about a year or two, and we went to visit a church that one of your good friends was preaching at in New York, and had a great service and sung all the songs and with my Pentecostal brethrens and sisterins. And anyway, great time to be had. Great time to be had, y'all. That's why we need each other to survive, y'all. And after the service, he came up to us. And, we're just as clueless as the day is long. Right. And he's like, hey, I got to go visit this sister who didn't make it to church. I'm worried about her. Y'all want to come with me? And we're like, sure, we want to do ministry.
Yeah.
Lord have mercy. I should have said no. We went, and he was able to find her, and she was in the ER. Yeah. And I remember walking into the room and seeing this young African-American woman, beautiful, beautiful young woman, probably maybe early 20s, beaten bloody, swollen, beaten so severely that a part of her ear was detached. Yeah. And I was in shock. Yeah. And I had at the time I was studying family systems and was doing a unit on trauma. Yeah. I think the Lord may have even used that encounter for me to continue on, for that to be my specialty, to go into kind of extended trauma work with survivors and offenders. Right. But I remember being just struck silent. Yeah. By that moment, and not having even words to say to her, but I think I approached her and told her that we are here, and that I thanked her for letting us be in that space with her. Yeah. I had nothing else to say. Right. And then I watched as that pastor struggled with the dynamics of domestic violence. Right. The dynamics of would she stay or would she go, or where would she go, and what resources did she have, right. and his own desperation to figure out what to do next. And I also realized that he was limited by his lack of knowledge. Right. He had a desire to serve, right. but he was ignorant. Right. He was ignorant. Yeah. And what it showed me was the importance of being appropriately and properly equipped. Yep. To serve others well. That we have to be equipped to serve others well. Our good intentions are not enough. Yeah. And our good intentions without wisdom and without knowledge and accountability, those good intentions can be destructive in and of themselves. Yeah.
They're huge costs for not recognizing the limits of our own callings and competence. Right. and pastoral jurisdiction. I mean, huge costs because I think about this. I think about if people walked in on a Sunday morning and there was a dead body on the pastor's floor, what would they do? They would immediately call the police.
I hope so.
I hope so. Lord have mercy. They would immediately call the police.
I hope so.
Because we will recognize that a crime has occurred.
Yes, and we're not cornered.
And we are not equipped,
We can't.
right? We are not equipped to investigate and handle this.
Right.
Okay, we can pray together. There are certain things that fall under our jurisdictions as pastors, but then there's things that we have to give over to the state, and that's okay. We can be Romans 13 Christians and say, hey, look, the state. This is something that's under because they have the expertise to investigate. They have the expertise to be able to recognize the signs of abuse. They have the expertise, and so. But when it comes to issues of domestic violence and sexual assault, a lot of times we think that we have to be the investigative body, right? That we have to handle it all in-house, right? And when we do that, we put victims at risk, okay? We do a tremendous disservice to the community when we don't recognize the limits of our own pastoral jurisdiction. Right?
You know, do you have some recommendations for clergy and for people who are there in the local church who may not be clergy, but whose gifts are stirred up, right? And are there to serve the local congregation as well, about how to support and challenge their church around these issues so that we can serve well?
Right, yeah. I would say one thing is talk about this where the Bible talks about it. Right? The Bible does. There are a lot of, there are folks, there are a lot of diners in our congregations. And we need to be willing to, to talk to the diners in the way in which the Lord talks to the diners. Right? The Lord put Genesis 34 in the Bible for a reason. He knew we would need it. And we need to open it up, and we need to talk about it. We need to not be, there's so many folks that are like, I didn't even know that was in the Bible, I listened to a number of sermons on Genesis 34 in preparation for preaching on Genesis 34. And it was so interesting what people did with that passage. I mean, I heard a lot of sermons about, don't come out from under the protection of your father, okay? And there were so many sermons that essentially found ways of blaming Dinah for her own assault, okay? But the Bible never blames Dinah for being raped. And that's so important. We gotta say that to the Dinahs, that listen, listen, nobody deserves to be raped. Nobody deserves to be raped. Okay? And if you cannot say that unequivocally, then you might not be fit to be a shepherd.
Most communities have organizations that take up these topics, that train churches and schools, and that's one thing that we often commend to people, is to find out what is the local organization in your city that equips secular and Christian spaces around issues of sexual abuse, sexual assault, and domestic violence, and have the humility to seek out what they have to share. And you don't have to agree 100%, but they probably know more than you know about that topic. So you can critically discern, but even submitting yourself to people who have studied that topic, who are currently serving people who are survivors, softens our hearts. And it impacts our witness as people who want to get better at this topic, who want to get better as servants, as ambassadors of Christ. And our local community is an organization called Safe Haven. But I would challenge the people in the room to figure out what is the organization in your community that works with local churches and schools around these topics to equip them.
That's right.
And they can do things like go in and talk to you about your policies and practices. Yeah. And they can offer trainings to your church. But I would say make it a priority to do, because there are people who currently could be victimized, but certainly there are survivors in your church right now. Yeah.
Churchcares.com is another resource. I had the privilege of being able to serve under actually the Southern Baptist Convention. J.D. Greer, Pastor J.D., helped to commission a kind of a task force to go and pull together some resources to offer churches and especially church leaders to begin to navigate these questions. And it's a free resource online at churchcares.com, and it really deals with how to become a church that cares well for the abused. Yeah. And Rachel Den Hollander, Diane Langberg, Chris Moles, a number of experts that have been working with these issues for a long time have really poured out a lot of wisdom about how to get into the very nitty-gritty of these issues, how to deal with, how to file a report, how to work with CPS, how to, just all kinds of really practical questions. So I think that's an important resource that folks should really avail themselves of as well. And I think the curriculum, you can get it at Lifeway as well. I think it's like maybe $6 or $7. So it's a good resource.
I was going to add, perfect love casts out fear.
Yeah.
And we have to do gut checks of what are our motives? What is driving us? Mm-hmm. What is driving us? Is it fear to cover up and protect an image, a theology, a branch of the church, a denomination, a tradition? Or is it love of the actual people? And I would argue that Scripture is clear that we are called to love our neighbor, that we're called to love fellow believers, we're called to love our enemies, but we're called to love actual people,
right.
Flesh and blood people,
right.
More than denominations, more than an image, more than a worldview, more than a political orientation. We are called to love living, breathing people.
Yeah.
And when we don't love people,
yeah.
we lose all credibility with them.
Absolutely, mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I would add, find ways. Listen up. Please find ways to listen to women. Okay. And I know we've been talking about that a lot. We should talk about it more and more. Okay. Find ways to elevate them within the congregation. So in our congregation, we had a number of folks be trained at one of these organizations. And a number of those folks are women, and a lot of times women are not going to disclose this to a man, okay? Because they have been, betrayed by a man oftentimes. And a man signifies something, fearful for them. And so but they might be willing to disclose to a trusted sister, okay? And we have to, in public ways, find a way to say, hey, look, if you know that you are a Dinah, if you know this is your experience, here are some people you can talk to, okay? And they will come alongside you, and the community will come alongside you as you walk through this, okay? So I think that's really important as well. We got to find ways to elevate women's voices so that they can be a place of refuge within our congregations as well.
And I would say, and the elevation of those voices are vital for many reasons, because the Spirit is at work in all of God's church. It's also on a practical level incredibly important, because when women share the truth of their experiences, if we have a theology or a system that has trained us to devalue them, to say that they're easily deceived, right. Then when they give testimony of abuse, right. We have already been socialized and in some cases radicalized to take for granted their words about their own experience. Right. So we go from not believing women on the Bible to also not believing women about their own reality.
Right.
And we deserve to be rebuked for that.
Absolutely. 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 That is so vitally important. So I believe we're out of time now. I would love to, I'm going to keep talking to you about this, but
I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to talk to you as well.
Continue to talk.
Thank you.
The conversation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Welcome to our table.
Yeah, welcome to our table.
And goodbye.